Scientists put people with green eyes inside a genome scanner, compared their DNA against thousands of other people, mapped every gene that touched the iris, measured the actual pigment inside green eyes under laboratory conditions, and what they found broke something they had believed for over 100 years. Not adjusted it, not refined it, broke it. Because it turned out that the most basic thing everyone assumed about green eyes, the thing that was printed in biology textbooks, taught in classrooms, and repeated by parents trying to predict what their unborn baby would look like, was completely wrong. Green eyes are not what anyone thought they were. Not the color, not the cause, not the age, not the origin. Every single layer of this story turned out to be stranger than the explanation that replaced it. And once you hear what researchers actually found, you will never look at a pair of green eyes the same way again. Let me start with the thing you were almost certainly taught, because understanding how wrong it was is the only way to appreciate how extraordinary the truth actually is. If you took a biology class at any point in the last century, you were probably handed a version of eye color that worked like a simple coin toss. You inherit one eye color gene from your mother and one from your father. Brown is dominant, blue is recessive, green sits somewhere fuzzy in the middle. The strongest gene wins. It was clean, it was simple. A teacher could write it on a whiteboard in 5 minutes. You could fill in a grid and predict a baby's eye color before it was born. 2 blue-eyed parents should always produce a blue-eyed child. 2 brown-eyed parents should almost never produce a blue-eyed baby. Brown dominates everything, remember? That was the rule. That was the model. That was what the textbook said. There was just one problem. It was wrong. Not slightly off, not in need of a small tweak. Wrong at the foundation. Wrong in a way that the real data, actual human DNA from thousands of real people, demolished almost instantly. Think about all the situations that quietly broke that tidy classroom rule for decades before anyone admitted what they meant. 2 brown-eyed parents who somehow produced a blue-eyed child. Not one family, not a handful of rare exceptions. Families all over the world consistently, generation after generation. According to the old model, that should essentially never happen. Brown dominates everything, and yet those pale blue eyes kept appearing in families where no blue-eyed parent was sitting at the dinner table, and then there were the siblings. Same 2 parents, same shared pool of genes, completely different eyes around the same table. One child with deep chestnut brown, one with soft shifting hazel, one with cool gray, and one with that striking, unmistakable forest green. The old chart had no combination of boxes you could fill in to produce that kind of spread from a single set of parents. Geneticists waved these cases away for years as anomalies, statistical noise, rare exceptions that did not threaten the underlying rule. But anomalies have a way of piling up, and eventually the scientific tools caught up with the questions. When researchers finally sat down and tested the old inheritance model against actual human DNA at a scale no one had ever attempted before, scanning thousands of genomes and comparing them directly to the eye colors those real people actually had, the comfortable story collapsed almost immediately. Because eye color is not governed by one gene. It is not governed by 2 or 3. The most recent research has identified over 60 genes that influence the color of a single human eye, with new genetic regions still being discovered as genome scanning technology improves. 60 genes, each one nudging the final outcome slightly. Some adding pigment, some reducing it, some changing the way light bounces and scatters inside the eye. Scientists call a trait like this polygenic, meaning built not from one instruction, but from a whole committee of them, all voting at once. And this is where green becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because if brown or blue can emerge from a wide range of genetic combinations, green cannot. Green is the product of a very specific, very narrow genetic configuration that has to line up almost perfectly for the color to appear at all. It is not one lucky roll of the genetic dice. Imagine you had dozens of separate dice, and to produce green, every single one of them had to land within a precise and narrow range at exactly the same moment. That is closer to the truth of what is happening inside a green iris. Scientists call this a Goldilocks zone. The melanin cannot be too high, or you get brown. It cannot be too low, or you get blue. It has to be exactly right. And then, even with the melanin perfectly calibrated, something else still has to be in place. Something that has nothing to do with pigment at all. To understand what that something is, you have to understand the 2 genes that researchers have identified as doing the heaviest lifting in the entire system. The first is called OCA2. It sits on the 15th human chromosome, and its job is deceptively simple to describe and staggeringly important in practice. OCA2 carries the instructions for building a protein called the P protein, and the P protein has one central responsibility inside the developing eye. It governs how much melanin gets deposited into the iris. Melanin is the same pigment that colors your skin and your hair. In the iris, it does exactly what it does everywhere else. It absorbs light, and the more of it there is, the darker the surface appears. Think of OCA2 as the volume knob for pigment. When it is working at full capacity, packing the iris with melanin, the eye drinks in almost all the light that strikes it, and the result is a brown so deep it can look nearly black in a dim room. Dial that production down and you get lighter browns, then warm hazel tones. Then further still you arrive at the pale end of the spectrum, the greens and the pale blues and the cool grays. OCA2 sets the baseline. It determines whether there is enough melanin in the iris to make brown at all, or whether the eye is left mostly empty of pigment, an open canvas waiting for other forces to paint on. But here's the twist that makes the whole system so much stranger than a simple volume knob. OCA2 does not set its own volume. It does not decide how loudly to play. Something else does that for it. Sitting immediately adjacent to OCA2 on the same chromosome is another gene called HERC2. And HERC2 is where the real intrigue begins. HERC2 does not make any pigment. It does not produce melanin. It does not build the P protein. It does not touch the iris directly at all. What it does is far more subtle and in a way far more powerful. HERC2 controls how much OCA2 gets turned on in the first place. If OCA2 is the volume knob, HERC2 is the hand resting on that knob deciding how far to turn it. Researchers describe it as acting like a dimmer switch. It does not generate the light. It regulates the ceiling on how much light is allowed. Between these two genes, OCA2 and HERC2, scientists can explain most of the variation in human eye color. Not all 60 genes fighting for equal say, but these two dominant players setting the fundamental brightness of the whole picture, with the other genes tuning the details around the edges. And then, in 2008, a team of researchers went looking inside HERC2 to find out exactly how it flips that dimmer switch. Buried deep inside HERC2, in a stretch of DNA that does not even code for a protein, they found a single genetic letter with an influence wildly out of proportion to its size. Just one letter in the four-letter alphabet of DNA. The A, the T, the C, and the G that spell out every living thing. One single position in the sequence. Geneticists named it RS29133832. It is what scientists call a single nucleotide polymorphism, which is the technical term for a spot in the genome where one letter can vary from person to person. At this particular spot, the letter is either a T or a C. That is the entire difference. One letter swapped for another in a region of the gene that does not build anything at all, and yet that swap correlates so strongly with eye color that researchers found they could predict from that single position alone whether a person had brown or blue eyes, and do it with startling accuracy. Not a rough guess. A prediction reliable enough to feel almost unnerving. Your genome contains roughly 3 billion of these letters. 3 billion rungs on the twisting ladder of your DNA. And out of all 3 billion, this one single letter tucked away in a non-coding corner of a gene most people will never hear of plays an outsized role in something as visible and personal as the color you see when you look in the mirror. That is one of the cleanest, most extraordinary examples biologists have ever found of how a tiny change in DNA, the smallest possible edit, a single character rewritten, can ripple upward into a massive and obvious physical difference that anyone can see across a room. But here's where the story takes a turn that researchers genuinely were not ready for. Because everything described so far, this entire elegant system of melanin and dimmer switches does a brilliant job of explaining one thing above all others: brown versus blue. That HERC2 switch controls one axis. More melanin or less melanin, dark iris or light iris. Turn the dial up and you get brown. Turn it down and you get blue. It is clean. It is satisfying. It accounts for the two most common eye colors on Earth almost entirely on its own. But it does not explain green. Green is not simply a stop somewhere along the melanin dial. You cannot produce green just by turning the pigment down a little less than blue or a little more than hazel. Green requires something extra, an additional layer of biology that goes beyond the simple question of how much melanin is deposited in the iris. And to understand that extra layer, researchers had to stop thinking about eye color as a matter of pigment at all, at least not entirely, and start thinking about it as a combination of pigment and physics. Because the truth about green eyes, the fact that catches nearly everyone off guard when they first hear it, is this: there is no green pigment in the human eye. None. There is no green molecule sitting in your iris. No substance tinted the color of moss or emerald or sea glass. No matter how vividly green a person's eyes appear, no matter how much they seem to glow that color in certain light, there is not a single speck of green pigment anywhere in the tissue producing that effect. Let that settle for a moment, because it genuinely upends the intuition most people carry. We assume that a green thing is green because it contains something green, the way a red apple contains red pigment or a leaf contains chlorophyll. Green eyes break that rule completely. The green you see when you look at green eyes is not a pigment you are looking at. It is something the eye is doing to light. It is an illusion. assembled from structure and physics. And once you understand how it is built, the entire spectrum of human eye color, every hazel, every amber, every impossible shifting shade of gray, suddenly makes a kind of sense it never did before. To see how, you have to look at how the iris is actually layered. The front portion of the iris, the part you're looking at when you meet someone's gaze, is called the stroma. And the stroma is not a solid wall of color. It is a loose, semi-transparent mesh of collagen fibers, structural proteins woven together, threaded through with only a small amount of a pale yellowish pigment. That yellow pigment has its own name. It is called lipochrome, and it is going to matter enormously in a moment. But first, the collagen. Because when light enters the eye and strikes that fine mesh of collagen fibers, something happens to it that has almost nothing to do with pigment, and almost everything to do with the physics of how light behaves when it scatters off tiny structures. When light hits those microscopic collagen fibers, the shorter wavelengths, the blues, scatter more easily than the longer wavelengths, the reds and the oranges. So more blue light bounces back out of the eye toward the observer. This is called Rayleigh scattering. And if the name sounds familiar, it should. This is remarkably similar to the reason the sky appears blue. The sky is not blue because there's blue paint spread across it. It is blue because sunlight scatters off molecules in the atmosphere, and the blue wavelengths scatter most. Your eyes, astonishingly, are doing a smaller and more intimate version of the exact same trick. A blue iris is not a blue pigmented iris. It is a nearly colorless stroma with very little melanin scattering light back at you in a way your brain reads as blue. Now, bring the lipochrome back into the picture. Layer that structural blue produced entirely by light scattering underneath a thin veil of yellowish lipochrome pigment sitting in the stroma. What happens? The same thing that happens on an artist's palette when a brush of blue drags through a smear of yellow. They combine into green. That is the whole secret. The entire secret. Green eyes are structural blue light scattered off collagen fibers, viewed through a soft wash of yellow lipochrome. Blue physics plus yellow pigment equals green perception. And there is not one single molecule of green anywhere in that equation. The color is an event produced by the interaction of structure and light. It is not stored in the tissue. It does not exist in the dark. It is generated in real time every time light falls on those collagen fibers and passes through that thin yellow filter. Move the person under a warm amber lamp, and the green deepens toward gold. Take them outside under a gray, overcast sky, and it cools toward a mossy, shadowed tone. Same eye, same genes, different physics. This is not imagination. This is structural color doing exactly what structural color does. This is also why people with green eyes have always complained that cameras never get it right. One photo shows brown, another shows gray. Only occasionally does the camera catch what they see in the mirror. That is not a flaw in the camera. That is the honest truth of the trait. A green eye is a moving target because it depends entirely on the angle and quality of light striking that scattering layer at any given moment. You're not photographing a color. You are trying to photograph a condition that happens to be producing a color at that particular fraction of a second under that particular quality of light. And because that condition is sensitive to every variable in the environment, it shifts. And once you understand this, the instability stops being mysterious and starts being completely logical. This also explains something people with hazel eyes have insisted on for their whole lives, often to skeptical friends who accuse them of imagining it. Hazel eyes really do shift color depending on the light, the surroundings, and even the clothing someone is wearing. That is not vanity, and it is not wishful thinking. It is variable melanin distribution across the iris, combined with Rayleigh scattering. Different lighting genuinely emphasizes different components of the blend. The gold or amber ring some people have around their pupils, a phenomenon called central heterochromia, is another expression of the same underlying physics. Melanin clustered more densely near the pupil catches the light differently than the outer iris, where pigment is thinner. Same eye, two visually different zones, both produced by the same mechanism, running at slightly different intensities. Now, here is the part that shocked the researchers who were digging through ancient DNA, because you might assume that a trait this specific, this dependent on such a precise combination of factors all aligning at once, must be ancient. Something that has been drifting through human populations for tens of thousands of years, spreading gradually across the globe. Ancient DNA said otherwise, and it overturned an assumption almost everyone held. When researchers analyzed 348 samples of ancient DNA from archaeological sites across Europe and Asia, published in early 2025 as a landmark study on European pigmentation history, they found something they were not prepared for. Most ancient Europeans had dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. And they kept that combination right up until roughly 3,000 years ago. A 2025 study published and covered by Live Science confirmed this finding directly. Dark pigmentation was the overwhelming norm in Europe for tens of thousands of years. Light eyes, light skin, The whole pale pigmentation pathway that green eyes belong to is remarkably, almost shockingly recent in evolutionary terms. 3,000 years is nothing on a geological timescale. It is less than the blink of an eye compared to how long our species has existed. The trail for the origin of green eyes specifically leads toward the region surrounding the Caucasus Mountains, that ancient land bridge between Europe and Asia that served as a crossroads for migrating peoples, trade routes, and the mixing of gene pools that had been separated for thousands of years. Ancient remains from southern Siberia and the broader Pontic-Caspian steppe region, dating back over 4,000 years, carry some of the earliest genetic hints of the variant configuration responsible for lighter eyes. Research on the Yamnaya culture, the nomadic Bronze Age herders from the steppe, who are now understood to have reshaped the genetic landscape of Europe and South Asia through massive migrations, identifies this group as a primary vector for the spread of light pigmentation traits, including the genetic conditions that produce green eyes. From there, the trait rode outward on the great steppe migrations, concentrated through the founder effect and genetic drift, and grew especially common within Celtic and Nordic lineages. That is the reason Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia carry such high rates of green eyes today. Over 85% of the population of Ireland and Scotland has either blue or green eyes. That number is not a coincidence. It is a direct genetic echo of ancient migration routes, written into the faces of living people whose ancestors never knew each other. And yet, despite being so geographically concentrated in certain populations, green eyes turn up in nearly every region of the world. A genetic fingerprint carried far from its origin point by centuries of migration, trade, conquest, and the simple human tendency to fall in love across old boundaries. In populations where brown eyes dominate, green can still appear unexpectedly. Generations after someone carrying that narrow genetic configuration contributed their DNA to a family line. The trait stays dormant, invisible, waiting quietly inside carriers who show no trace of it, until the right combination reemerges generations later in a child who seems to have come from nowhere genetically. This is exactly what made the old classroom model so useless. There was no room in two-gene Mendelian thinking for a trait that could skip 3 generations, hide completely in carriers who showed no sign of it, and then suddenly surface in someone whose parents both appeared to have unremarkable brown eyes. With a 60-gene polygenic trait built on a Goldilocks zone of precise melanin calibration and light physics, that behavior is not a mystery at all. It is exactly what you would predict. There's also a practical fact worth knowing that came out of the medical research into green and light-colored eyes, and it is one that directly affects people who have them. Because the iris carries less protective melanin in green eyes than in brown eyes, the inner structures of the eye receive more light exposure. Research published in medical literature, including studies comparing thousands of patients across European populations, has consistently found that individuals with green, gray, blue, or hazel eyes have a meaningfully higher risk of developing uveal melanoma, a rare cancer of the middle layer of the eye. One widely cited case control study found that the risk of uveal melanoma was 2.5 times higher for people with green, gray, or hazel eyes compared to those with brown eyes. Another Dutch study comparing uveal melanoma patients against healthy controls found that individuals with green or hazel iris color had an odds ratio of 3.64 compared to brown-eyed individuals. That is a substantial difference in risk, driven directly by the reduced melanin that makes green eyes look the way they do. The same reduced pigment that produces the color also reduces the natural UV protection the iris provides to the interior of the eye. This does not mean that having green eyes is dangerous or that melanoma is a likely outcome. Uveal melanoma affects roughly 6 in every million adults in the United States annually, making it extremely rare in absolute terms. But the elevated relative risk is real, which is a genuinely good reason for people with lighter eyes to take UV protection seriously, to wear quality sunglasses that block UV light when outdoors, and to have regular eye examinations. The biology that produces something visually beautiful also comes with a trade-off, written into the same genetic code that produced it. There's one more dimension to this story that is easy to miss, but that makes the whole picture sit even more strangely in the mind when you sit with it. Because green eyes are so recent in evolutionary terms, and because the configuration required to produce them is so narrow and precise, they have never had enough time to become common enough for the trait to stabilize. They exist at the frontier of human variation, still spreading, still mixing, still appearing in populations where they were never common before as people move and travel and build families across old geographic and cultural lines. A green-eyed child born today in a family that has no recent memory of this trait is not experiencing some ancient inheritance reawakening. They are experiencing a genetic combination that has been quietly carried forward, generation after generation, waiting for the precise configuration of dozens of factors to align again. And every time it does, the result is something that was not there before. A new pair of eyes that produces a color by doing something to light, rather than by containing any color at all. A trait whose very existence depends on physics as much as biology. A color that is an event rather than a substance. The tidy classroom chart that most people carry in their heads, the one with brown dominant and blue recessive and green somewhere vaguely in between, did not just simplify the truth. It buried a story that is far more astonishing than the fiction it replaced. No single gene, no coin flip, no green pigment anywhere in the equation. Instead, over 60 genetic contributors all voting at once. A Goldilocks zone of melanin that has to be calibrated exactly right. A mesh of collagen fibers scattering blue light the same way the sky scatters it, a wash of yellow lipochrome acting as a natural filter, and an origin point buried in Bronze Age steppe migrations that is only about 4,000 years old. Something that the majority of our species walked the earth for over 200,000 years without ever producing. And that is still so precisely balanced, so dependent on everything being exactly right at exactly the same moment, that it still only shows up in about 2 out of every 100 people alive today. 2% of 8 billion people is still roughly 160 million human beings walking around with eyes that produce a color that does not exist anywhere in their tissue. Not a pigment, not a dye. A physics experiment running continuously in the front layer of their eyes every time light falls on them. And when the light changes, the experiment changes too. The color shifts. The green deepens or fades or warms or cools depending on what is happening in the world around them. It is not a fixed object. It is a continuous process. An ongoing collaboration between biology and light and the exact quality of the moment. That is what researchers found when they looked closely. And that is why, once you understand it, you will never look at a pair of green eyes the same way again.